When you hear the word tribe, what's the first image that pops into your head?
Hmm.
Maybe it's people in a remote jungle, living simply, speaking a language you've never heard.
Yeah, that's a really common picture, isn't it?
It is.
And that's exactly where we need to begin this deep dive, because that image, well, while it's common, it's often a creation. It's a concept, shaped over time, not always reflecting reality.
Okay, so let's really unpack this then. Our mission today is to understand this whole idea of tribe in India.
Uh-huh.
We'll look at how the term even came about, how different people tried to define it, and importantly, how it still shapes modern India. We're drawing on the sources you've gathered for us.
And throughout our conversation, we should keep asking ourselves and asking you, the listener, does this word tribe really capture the incredibly rich and diverse reality of these communities?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it a label that maybe needs a closer look?
Definitely. So let's start right at the beginning. Our sources tell us something quite striking. Tribe, much like the word caste, isn't really an idea that originated within India.
That's right. It was, as one source puts it, a category imported, primarily by European powers during the colonial period, say between the 17th and 19th centuries.
Imported, okay. And there wasn't a clear objective definition.
Not at all. It was incredibly subjective. And what's fascinating is how these communities saw themselves. Take the Mundas, for example.
Okay.
A group often labeled a tribe. They call themselves Iroko,
Iroko.
meaning men or humans.
Mm-hmm.
They believed their race, the Ilro, was the original creation. They saw themselves not as some subgroup, but as, well, humanity itself.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a powerful way to see yourselves, not just a part of something, but the origin point.
Exactly. And there's another great example, the coned tribes of Odisha.
Mm-hmm.
When scholar Felix Petal was studying them, he asked about their community. And they actually turned the question back on him.
They did. What did they ask?
They asked if cones lived where he came from.
No way. So they thought.
It implies they believed the whole world was basically inhabited by cones, by people like them.
That really tells you something, doesn't it? The way outsiders defined tribe was just completely different from how these groups saw themselves. It shows how labels can really distort reality.
Totally subjective.
So if the term didn't really fit their self-perception, why did the Europeans introduce it? What was the point?
Well, fundamentally, it became an administrative tool,
Hmm.
a way for the British, primarily, to categorize people they saw as being outside the mainstream Hindu Varna system.
Right, outside the caste system.
Exactly. And classifying them made governance, taxation, control, just much easier for the colonial administration.
Okay, that makes a kind of strategic, if uncomfortable, sense. And following that strategy, early scholars, often linked with the East India Company, started trying to define these categories, using the theories of the time.
They did. And one of the first big theories they used was called classical evolutionism.
Classical evolutionists.
Right. This idea really came out of the Renaissance and Enlightenment in Europe. Science was gaining ground over religion, and people started thinking societies evolved, in stages, kind of like biological evolution.
Oh, okay.
And as Europeans traveled more, traded more, they encountered all these incredibly diverse cultures around the world, which naturally made them ask, well, why are they so different from us?
And this led, maybe unfortunately, to a feeling of European superiority?
Yes, it often did. They started seeing other societies as earlier, sort of less developed stages of human progress,
Yeah.
almost like the childhood of their own supposedly civilized
For
society.
childhood. Okay.
So the label tribe then became a convenient way to describe societies they thought were, quote, arrested in some backward stage of cultural development, farthest from European civilization.
And they used specific criteria to label them.
Yeah, all sorts of criteria, often quite random. Things like practicing animism, the belief that spirits are in natural objects, or tracing family lines through the mother, matrilineal descent, or even technology levels, like Morgan's stages of savagery, barbarism, and civilization.
Savagery, barbarism, those are loaded terms.
Extremely loaded. And this idea of backwardness wasn't just academic. It had real-world consequences. It was used to justify colonization.
How so?
Well, if these tribes practiced communal land ownership, which many did, the Europeans could declare the land terra nullius.
Latin for no one's land.
Exactly. And if it's no one's land, then the principle is finder is the keeper.
So they could just take it.
They could. It's quite chilling how an academic theory could provide a justification for taking land, for imposing rule, and sometimes, sadly, even for violence against people deemed less human.
It really shows how ideas, even academic ones, are tied to power and history. They weren't just thoughts in books. They had real impact.
Absolutely. These theories were deeply linked to the whole colonial project.
Okay, so classical evolutionism gave us this picture of backward tribes. But then another theory came along, functionalism. This one sounded more scientific, focusing on field work. Did it do a better job?
Functionalism definitely shifted the method. It emphasized going out, living with, and studying communities directly. Anthropologists looked for what they called small, well-lit societies for their research.
Small, well-lit societies, like a laboratory?
Kind of. And they often refer to the group they studied as my tribe. Think Malinowski in the Trobrianders or Evans Pritchard in the Newer.
Right, and what did they conclude from these studies?
They came up with a few key characteristics they believed defined tribes. First, they saw them as homogenous.
Meaning everyone was basically the same.
Pretty much, yeah. Shared beliefs, values, daily lives. Very uniform.
That sounds a bit too neat. What else?
Second, they saw them as bounded. Activities were tightly regulated by social norms, keeping everything in a state of equilibrium. They didn't really change much.
Equilibrium, unchanging.
Yeah.
And this led to that really startling claim, didn't it?
It did. Because they were seen as unchanging, stuck in this equilibrium, functionalists claimed tribes had no history.
No history. That's such a massive statement. Can any community truly exist without a past, without evolution? It seems dismissive.
It's a very strong claim, and one that's been heavily criticized, as we'll get to. The third idea was isolated.
Cut off from everyone else.
Right. No contact with outsiders meant, in their view, no change, no innovation. It reinforced that static picture.
And does that perception still linger today?
Definitely. Even now, many people still have this image of tribes as isolated, primitive, unchanging groups. It shows how powerful those early academic ideas were.
But not everyone's stuck to that. You mentioned Ellman's Service. He had a different take.
Yes, Service proposed what's called a new evolutionary theory, but he framed it differently. He saw tribes not necessarily as backward, but as a specific political type.
A political type? How?
He saw societies evolving in terms of organizational complexity, from simple bands to tribes and chiefdoms and finally states.
So it's about how society is structured, how it's organized.
Exactly. As societies get more complex, they develop specialized institutions like separate political systems, economic systems, religious institutions. In simpler societies like bands or tribes, according to Service, the same group, often based on family or kinship, handles everything.
Okay, so less specialization. And did Service rank these stages?
He explicitly said it wasn't about progression or hierarchy, just different stages of complexity. But, the language of evolution is still there.
Right. And how did he define a tribe's political system?
For tribes, he said, the political system was primarily based on kinship and descent. Your identity, your rights, your power, it all came from your family, your lineage.
Got it. Your birth determines your place.
Pretty much. So Service offered a different lens, focusing on political organization rather than just backwardness or isolation.
Okay, we've traced how the idea of tribe was shaped by colonial needs and academic theories. But how did this concept actually get put into practice? How did it become official policy in India?
Two big things really pushed it forward: tribal rebellions and the British census.
Rebellions. Tell me more.
Well, interestingly, before the British really took hold, sources suggest Indian kingdoms generally had okay relationships with tribal groups. Often, those forest areas were like natural buffers against enemies. There aren't many records of big tribal rebellions before British rule.
But that changed under the British.
Drastically. Starting around the late 18th century, you see major revolts. The Santhal Rebellion, the Coal Revolt, the Munda uprisings, they became much more frequent.
Why? What were the British doing?
Introducing new, often harsh land revenue systems, allowing money lenders into tribal areas who trapped people in debt.
Right.
Basically disrupting traditional economies and life.
So exploitation led to rebellion. Makes sense.
But here's the twist. Instead of admitting their policies were causing the unrest, the British often blamed others.
Blame too.
They often pointed fingers at caste Hindus, claiming they were the ones encroaching on tribal lands and exploiting the tribes.
Shifting the blame. Convenient.
Very. And this narrative actually helped solidify the need for a separate tribe category. The British could then position themselves as the protectors of these supposedly vulnerable groups, needing special administration.
So the rebellions, ironically, strengthened the case for the category. And the other factor was the census.
Absolutely crucial. The British Census of India was the tool used to officially categorize and list these communities as tribes.
How did they decide who went on the list?
Well, the criteria kept changing. which tells you how subjective it was.
Right.
In 1881, they started by classifying based on religion, basically. If you practiced animism, you were distinct from caste groups.
Okay.
By 1921, they added territory. So you got labels like hill and forest tribes.
Then in 1931.
They introduced primitiveness, a really vague and, frankly, insulting term. These became the primitive tribes.
Primitive tribes. Wow, that must have felt awful.
You'd imagine so. That term was later softened a bit. The Government of India Act of 1935 replaced primitive with backwardness.
Backward tribes. Slightly better, maybe.
Marginally. It acknowledged economic, educational, or technological disadvantages. Then, the last census under the British, 1941, focused simply on tribal origin. If your father was listed as tribal, you were too.
So it became hereditary.
Yes. And here's the critical link to today. Independent India, when creating its own lists for affirmative action, largely adopted that final British list of backward tribes from 1935.
They just took the list.
Pretty much. They just renamed it scheduled tribes.
So the foundation of the ST list today is essentially a colonial-era administrative list based on shifting, subjective, and often derogatory criteria.
That's a big part of the legacy, yes.
Yeah.
It wasn't a definition built from the ground up by independent India based on its own understanding.
That's huge. What a legacy to inherit.
It really is. And this leads us straight into the post-colonial era, where scholars started to seriously question the term tribe itself.
Because of that negative baggage.
Exactly. Many found it derogatory, deeply tied to those colonial ideas of backwardness and primitiveness. They started looking for alternatives.
Like what?
The term ethnic groups gained favor. It puts the emphasis on a community having a unique culture and, importantly, a desire to maintain that culture.
That feels more neutral, more respectful, maybe focusing on culture rather than some perceived lack of development.
I think so. And this shift in perspective also completely flipped the script on the backward idea.
How so?
Instead of backward, tribes started being seen as potentially the wisest, possessing vast indigenous knowledge, especially about the environment, having a sustainable relationship with nature.
Wow, a total 180 turn from primitive to wise.
It's a huge shift. Think about examples like the Hindu people in the Philippines. One study found they knew over 1,600 plant species.
Incredible.
Or here in India, healers like Lakshmi Kuti, who won a Padma Shri award for her incredible knowledge of local medicinal plants. India even created the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, the TKDL.
Right, I've heard of that, to protect traditional knowledge, like for things like Tulsi or turmeric, from being patented elsewhere.
Exactly. It shows a recognition of the value of this knowledge. And if you think bigger picture, this suggests indigenous practices might hold real solutions for modern problems, like environmental damage.
A very different perspective from the colonial view. And what about that idea of isolation? Did post-colonial scholars challenge that too?
Oh, definitely. They dug into history and found lots of evidence suggesting tribes were never truly isolated, despite what the functionalists claimed.
Like what kind of evidence?
Well, you find figures in ancient Indian texts like Shabri or Dimba from the Mahabharata, or even the Vanarasena in the Ramayana. Some scholars interpret these as references to interactions with tribal groups.
Interesting, so connections going way back.
Potentially, yes. Some even suggest that figures called asuras in old Brahminical texts might have actually been tribal communities. The point is, interaction seems much more likely than total isolation.
And this idea of interaction led to another concept.
Yes, the tribe-caste continuum. This argues that tribe and caste aren't these rigid, separate boxes. They're more like points on a spectrum, fluid and flexible, with constant interaction and cultural exchange happening between them for centuries.
So not separate worlds, but interconnected ones.
Exactly. The modern academic view is pretty much the opposite of the colonial one. Tribes seen as knowledgeable, wise, historically connected, and part of fluid social categories.
Okay, so that's the academic shift. But let's get back to the ground level, the administrative reality. We mentioned scheduled tribes, or STs. Can you clarify the difference between just tribe and scheduled tribe?
It's a really important distinction. Tribe is more of a cultural or academic concept with all the history and debate we've discussed. Scheduled tribe, or ST, is specifically a politico-administrative category.
Politico-administrative.
Meaning
Yeah,
it's a list created by the government, defined in the Constitution, specifically for identifying communities that qualify for certain welfare schemes, reservations in education and jobs, political representation, things like that.
So it's a legal and governmental label for affirmative action purposes.
Precisely. Article 366 25 and 342 of the Constitution give the president the power, after consulting with state governors, to specify which communities are STs.
And getting on that list? It's not simple, is it?
Not at all. It's a multi-step bureaucratic process.
Yeah.
A proposal usually starts with the state government.
Okay.
Then it goes to the Central Ministry of Tribal Affairs, then to the Registrar General of India, or RGI, then the National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, NCST, then back to the cabinet, and finally the president issues the notification.
Wow, that sounds exhausting. A real marathon, like you said, years, probably decades for some communities.
It could definitely take a very long time. And the criteria used after independence are also interesting.
What criteria did independent India settle on?
Well, early on, the Kalokar Commission kind of re-emphasized those old ideas, primitiveness, backwardness, and also noted tribes' separate, exclusive existence.
Still using those loaded terms.
Yes. Then, in 1965, the Lokur Committee came up with 5 main criteria that are, believe it or not, still largely the basis for inclusion today.
Still used now. What are they?
The Lokur criteria are primitive traits, geographical isolation, distinct culture, shyness of contact with outsiders, and backwardness, economic, social, educational.
Wait a minute. This sounds remarkably similar to the colonial criteria, just maybe phrased a bit differently. Primitive traits, isolation, shyness.
They are very similar, and that's a major point of criticism, as we'll see. These criteria led to issues like area restriction.
Right, you mentioned that. Initially, ST status was tied to a tiny local area.
Yes, a block or district. If you moved for work or anything else, you could lose your ST status and benefits. Imagine the impact on mobility and opportunity.
That seems incredibly restrictive. Did that change?
Thankfully, yes. The Removal of Area Restriction Act in 1976 changed it, so ST status applied at the state level. A big improvement for mobility.
Okay, that's better. But did that solve everything?
Not quite. It created new, weird situations. You could have the same community, like the Banjaras, for example, recognized as an ST in one state, but maybe as a scheduled caste, SC, or other backward class, OBC, just across the border in another state.
How is that even possible? Your identity changes when you cross a state line. Does that seem fair or logical to you?
It raises huge questions about fairness and consistency, doesn't it? It complicates everything from accessing rights to maintaining a unified community identity.
Absolutely. Any exceptions to the state-level rule?
Yes, particularly in the Northeast. States like Assam still distinguish between hill tribes and plain tribes for certain benefits. And in Manipur, you have complex situations with hill tribes like Kukis and Nagas versus the Meiteis predominantly in the plains, where geography still plays a big role in status due to historical and demographic tensions.
So it's still a complex patchwork, not a uniform system.
Far from it. And even with these criteria and procedures, getting included, or sometimes staying included, is fraught with problems.
Problems, like...
A major report came out in 2022 from the Rishikesh Panda Task Force. It really highlighted significant issues with the whole ST inclusion process.
What did the task force find?
They basically said the Lokur Committee's 5 criteria, primitive traits, isolation, distinct culture, shyness, backwardness, are obsolete, dogmatic, and rigid. They just don't fit reality anymore.
Obsolete. How so?
Well, think about it. Are all listed STs still primitive or backward today? Communities like the Minas in Rajasthan are quite integrated and successful. Many groups in the Northeast have high levels of education. The criteria just don't match.
And geographical isolation.
Almost impossible to argue now. We have roads everywhere, often for security reasons, plus tourism is booming in many formerly remote areas. How isolated can you be if tourists are visiting?
Good point. And distinct culture.
That's also fading or changing rapidly due to globalization, media, intercommunity contact, even religious conversions in some areas, and shyness of contact. That's just way too subjective. Who decides if a community is shy?
So the core criteria themselves are outdated.
That's what the task force argued. And they found specific, really concerning reasons why communities get excluded.
Like what?
Things that seem almost unbelievable. Wrong spellings or mispronunciations of a community's name in old official documents.
You're kidding. A typo.
Not kidding. The report mentions communities like the Petakurba in Karnataka or the Muki Dia in Odisha who were denied ST status for decades because of clerical errors like that.
30 years because someone misspelled their name. That's just staggering, the human cost of that.
It's truly shocking. Then there's the issue of states being divided. A community lives in an area, a new state border gets drawn right through it, and suddenly they have different statuses. ST on one side, maybe OBC or nothing on the other, like the Banjaras again, or the Gracias.
So political map drawing messes up people's identities and rights?
It can, yes. And another group often left out are the descendants of tribals who were forcibly moved during colonial times, like for tea plantations in Assam. They lost their connection to their original area and often lost their ST status in the new place, and many still haven't regained it.
Generations later, still paying the price for colonial policies.
Exactly. And the procedure for inclusion itself was criticized as cumbersome.
Cumbersome how? We know it's long, but what else?
A key bottleneck is the Registrar General of India, the RGI. They have the power to reject a state government's proposal, and if they reject it twice, the process basically ends for that community.
Okay, so they hold a lot of power. Do they have the expertise?
That's the criticism. The RGI mainly relies on census data, which is often collected by, say, primary school teachers. They don't necessarily have deep anthropological or sociological understanding to make these nuanced judgments about a community's identity and status.
So non-experts making critical decisions based on potentially limited data.
That's the concern. Even the Ministry of Home Affairs, way back in 1996, questioned if RGI was the right body for this. The Rishikesh Panda Task Force actually recommended that RGI and others should only give advice, and a special committee of experts should make the final decision.
That sounds sensible. Was that recommendation accepted?
No. The Ministry of Tribal Affairs rejected it.
Oh. So the potentially flawed process continues.
It seems so.
Yeah.
And even if a community does finally get ST status after all that struggle,
yes,
the actual changes on the ground, the welfare benefits, especially things like political representation, the number of reserved seats in legislatures often don't get updated properly or quickly, so the victory can feel hollow.
So it's a fight to get on the list and then maybe another fight to get the actual benefits. That sounds incredibly draining for these communities.
And the task force concluded the whole thing often feels more political than academic, meaning it's less about objective criteria and genuine need and more about vote bank politics. Which communities get attention? Often the ones who can make the most noise, who have better political connections or PR, as the source puts it. Smaller, less organized groups struggle to even get heard.
Right. It's about who gets included, not necessarily why.
That seems to be a major issue.
This whole discussion about who is an ST and why leads us to an even bigger, maybe more fundamental question. The idea of indigenous identity in India. How does this play out?
It's a really big debate, both internationally and within India. Internationally, you have bodies like the International Labor Organization, the ILO.
Okay.
Back in 1957, they had ILO Convention 107. India actually ratified this one. It talked about the progressive integration of indigenous populations into the broader national community, aiming for their upliftment while respecting their culture.
Integration, upliftment, okay.
But then, in 1989, ILO Convention 169 came along, and it marked a big shift.
A shift how?
It moved away from just integration and focused heavily on rights, specifically need rights and power rights.
Need rights and power rights, like what?
Things like the right to self-determination and self-government, rights over their traditional lands and resources, the right to maintain their distinct identity, culture, and language, much more focused on autonomy and agency.
That sounds significantly different. Did India ratify Convention 169?
No, India rejected it.
Rejected it. Why? That seems counterintuitive if the goal is to help these communities.
India gave two main reasons. First, the idea of self-determination and self-government was seen as a potential threat to national sovereignty and integrity, especially given that India already faced insurgencies in some tribal areas.
Okay, a security concern. What was the second reason?
This is a crucial point. India argued that all its citizens are equally indigenous to the land of India.
All citizens.
Yes. So designating one specific group tribals as uniquely indigenous would imply that other Indians are somehow migrants or outsiders. They felt this could be incredibly divisive internally.
Ah, I see. If everyone's indigenous, then singling out one group creates problems. That leads us right into the heart of the debate. Are tribes, or STs, technically indigenous in the Indian context?
Exactly. And there are strong arguments on both sides. Let's look at the arguments against using the term indigenous, specifically for tribes in India.
Okay, what's the case against?
First, India's history is just incredibly complex. It's not like, say, the US or Australia, where you had a clearer single wave of European colonization displacing existing populations. India has seen multiple waves of migration, conquest, assimilation over millennia.
Right. Aryans, Dravidians, Mughals, British. It's layered.
So where do you draw the line? Which historical point defines who is indigenous? If it's just before the British well then arguably all Indians are indigenous relative to the British. And you go further back, trying to label who was native versus migrant becomes almost impossible and incredibly politically charged.
It could open up endless historical debates and conflicts. What else?
The factor of acculturation and assimilation. Many tribal groups haven't lived in isolation. They've been neighbors with non-tribal groups for centuries. There's been huge amounts of cultural borrowing back and forth, sometimes even complete blending.
So their distinct culture might not be as distinct as the label implies.
For some groups, perhaps not. And some argue they haven't necessarily faced a unique kind of subjugation compared to, say, lower castes or other marginalized groups throughout history.
Okay. Any other points against?
Internal migration. Many tribal groups themselves have histories of moving within India. We mentioned the Santals moving to the Rajmahal Hills, the Orons moving from the Deccan. This complicates the claim of being the absolute original settlers of the specific place they live now.
So the argument is the label indigenous might be too simplistic for India's complex history and social reality and could create more divisions.
That's the core of the against position, often focusing on the historical and logical complexities.
Okay. But there must be strong arguments for recognizing tribes as indigenous, right? What's that side of the story? This often seems more emotionally driven, focused on rights.
Absolutely. A key argument is the sheer long period of settlement. Even if a group wasn't the very first group ever in an area, many tribal communities have lived in their territories for centuries, for countless generations. They argue this deep, long-standing connection to the land should be a major factor.
So it's not about being first, but about long, continuous habitation.
Right. Then there's the powerful idea of internal colonization.
Internal colonization, what does that mean?
Proponents, like the scholar P.K. Roy Berman, argue that even though India got independence from the external British colonizers, tribal communities continue to face a kind of colonization from within a country. They face ongoing marginalization, loss of control over their traditional lands and resources, often for big development projects or conservation, cultural assimilation pressures, and a general sense of powerlessness within the larger political and economic system. Their situation, it's argued, mirrors that of colonized peoples elsewhere.
So their lived experience feels like colonization, and even within independent India.
That's the argument, and this links to a demand for priority rights.
Priority rights.
The idea is, just like dominant linguistic or ethnic groups in many states claim sons of the soil privileges and try to protect their interests, tribals argue they should have prior rights and a decisive say over what happens in their traditional territories. Too often, they're displaced for dams, mines, or tiger reserves without meaningful consent.
They want a stronger voice in decisions affecting their lands and lives.
Exactly. Another factor is global solidarity. Being formally recognized as indigenous connects Indian tribal groups to a larger global movement.
A global community.
Yes. There are estimated to be over 370 million indigenous people across many nations. Recognition gives Indian groups a platform on the world stage, potentially more support from international NGOs, maybe even economic benefits through fair trade for tribal products.
So international connection and support. And what about internally within India?
This is where the term Adivasi comes in strongly.
Adivasi meaning original inhabitants.
Right. Many tribal communities and political groups prefer this term. There's a hope that embracing this shared Adivasi consciousness could help unite the many different scheduled tribes in India.
Unite them. Why is that important?
Because right now, there are over 730 distinct ST communities listed. They make up about 8.6% of India's population, but they're often divided by region, language, specific histories. They don't always act as a single political bloc.
So Adivasi identity could be a unifying force.
That's the idea. If they could unite under that banner, they could potentially wield much greater political influence, ensuring their collective issues, land rights, resource control, cultural preservation couldn't be ignored by state and national governments. It's about empowerment through unity.
So the indigenous or Adivasi identity is seen not just as a label, but as a potential source of political power and rights assertion.
Yes, it's deeply political and aspirational for many.
Wow. Okay, let's try to pull this all together. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We really have. It's a complex topic.
We started with that common image of a tribe and saw how the term itself was largely a colonial import, right? not really an Indian concept used by the British for administration.
Exactly. No clear objective definition, and very different from how communities saw themselves.
Then we looked at how early academic theories like classical evolutionism and functionalism often painted tribes as backward or isolated, which ended up justifying colonial actions.
Yeah, those early theories had real consequences, linking academic ideas to colonial power.
But post-colonial views flipped that script, didn't they? Seeing tribes instead as wise, knowledgeable, holding indigenous wisdom, and historically connected, not isolated.
A complete turnaround in perspective, challenging those old stereotypes and highlighting concepts like the tribe-caste continuum.
And we distinguished tribe as a concept from scheduled tribe, or ST, which is the official legal category in India used for affirmative action.
Right, a politico-administrative category born out of that colonial list,
Yeah.
with criteria for inclusion, privativeness, isolation, etc., that are still used today but widely seen as outdated and problematic.
Leading to all sorts of anomalies, communities excluded due to typos, split by state borders, facing cumbersome procedures, and the whole process feeling more political than objective.
Definitely. The Rishikesh Panda report really laid bare those systemic issues.
And finally, we unpack that huge debate around indigenous identity, why India rejected the later ILO convention, the arguments against applying the term uniquely to tribes in India's complex history.
Versus the strong arguments for it, focusing on long settlement, the experience of internal colonization, the need for priority rights, global solidarity, and the potential unifying power of an Adivasi consciousness.
It really shows how tangled history, identity, politics, and rights are in this whole discussion. It's not a simple term with a simple meaning.
Not at all. It's loaded with history and contemporary struggle.
So here's something to leave our listeners thinking about. If the very definition of tribe is so fluid, so historically constructed, so debated, what does that really mean for how we define identity, any identity, in modern society?
That's a deep question.
And maybe what responsibility do we all have to try and understand these